I just thought being a reporter was cool, and I thought of myself as a guy in a trench coat in the back of the room with a notebook in his hand, an observer on the sidelines, not a participant. You could affect things, but that was not what your purpose was. Your purpose was to report the news, without fear or favor, as the slogan has gone for so long, and you could have a front row seat, but you weren't involved, and I thought I couldn't think of anything I liked better. My name is Brit Hume, and I am the chief political analyst for the Fox News Channel.
How did you come to your job? You started as a cub reporter, and you immediately fell in love. Tell that story.
I was just out of college. I was married. There was a child on the way, and I was living in my then wife's hometown of West Hartford, Connecticut, and I needed a job. And I tried various things, and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I'd been happy as a happy-go-lucky college student, and now I had to get serious. And I struggled all that summer looking for work and couldn't really find anything that fit. I tried to get a job as a teacher, and that didn't work, and I tried several other things. And finally, through an employment agency, I was interviewed for a job as a cub reporter on the old Hartford, Connecticut Times, which was the afternoon newspaper in that town. And I'll never forget the first day I was in there. This noisy old newsroom. The newsroom in 1965, which was when this was not very different probably from the newsroom in 1935. Clattering typewriters. There's a guy on a copy desk whose name was Bill Shea, and if his name hadn't been Bill Shea, we would have needed to change his name to Bill Shea, because this guy was Bill Shea. And he had a stogie in his mouth and florid cheeks and white hair, and he called out in this deep voice, "Copy!" And I thought, and this whole sort of irreverent spirit about the place was so obvious, and I thought, this is the coolest place I've ever been. And so I went to work as a young reporter, and I've never been really but a reporter since. That was, 50-some years ago.
You immediately fell in love with the energy and the excitement and the new adventures.
Things were different every day, new story every day, and it was a good newspaper, actually. Very high standards. You had to write cleanly and crisply, and no editorializing. No editorializing was ever permitted from the reporters who worked there. You just couldn't do it. That was for the editorial page, and it just wasn't done.
Right. So now, decades later, you've stayed in the field of journalism. You loved it. You've built a highly successful career out of it. What kept you in journalism? Why is it so fun? Why is it so exciting?
I just thought being a reporter was cool, and I thought of myself as a guy in a trench coat in the back of the room with a notebook in his hand, an observer on the sidelines, not a participant. You could affect things, but that was not what your purpose was. Your purpose was to report the news, without fear or favor, as the slogan has gone for so long, and you could have a front row seat, but you weren't involved, and I thought I couldn't think of anything I liked better. That was kind of a finance town, insurance companies and so on, Hartford, Connecticut, and people looked at me very strangely when I talked about this great work I was doing, making very little money as a young reporter, but I thought it was the best thing you could be.
Yeah. And so walk me through, you started as a cub reporter, but you have an incredibly storied career, one of the most venerable political journalists of our time.
Oh, wow.
And so how did you get from cub reporter to building up the Fox News Washington Bureau to the huge success it is today?
Well, I wanted to get back to Washington, because one thing about growing up in Washington, although I was a terrible student, and I barely got out of school, barely got into college, and barely got out of college. But when you had the national government in your backyard growing up, and I had classmates whose parents were senators and major figures and so on.
Because you went to University of Virginia.
Later. And when I was growing up, I didn't really pay much attention to, it was just my hometown. But when you've been there and lived there, and then you're covering news in a relatively small city some distance away, you kind of want to get back to where you were. The news seemed more momentous. And also, I wanted to be near the Redskins. That was a big deal for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's true. I've always told the young student reporters I work with that spending a semester or a year in Washington, D.C. is almost like a rite of passage for a young journalist.
Well, I worked there, and then I went back. We finally moved out. I went to work for UPI for a while to get intense news writing, because you work on a desk in a bureau like the one in Hartford. You're writing and rewriting stories all through the day, and I felt like news writing experience under deadline pressure was what I needed, and I did that for a while, and then I came back to Washington finally, and I worked on the Evening Sun in Baltimore, another afternoon paper, now defunct. It was a good paper, and I just felt like I was learning my craft and trying to get better and trying to write better, trying to report better, and then I had a fellowship at what was called the Washington Journalism Center for a semester, and I got started on a book, and I didn't know if I could write a book, and the people I knew didn't think I could, and actually Ralph Nader helped me get the book contract. It was about the mine workers union, which was hopelessly corrupt, and it was a great topic, and I went to work on that while I was on that fellowship, and out of that came a job with Jack Anderson, the syndicated columnist. And I worked as an investigative reporter for him for several years, and then moved out on my own, wrote a book about my experiences there, and eventually sort of drifted into television. And I worked for the ABC News documentary unit for several years, because they had a documentary in the first documentary series, and the first installment in that series was about miners in West Virginia, and I'd written a book about that. So I went to work on that, and then from then I was asked if I'd like to try it as a correspondent, and I thought, well, I don't really think so. And I sort of thought of TV correspondents as people standing in makeup all over their faces and their hair sprayed, staring into an inanimate object, and I thought there was something slightly comical about it. But then after a while I thought about it, I was not really being honest with myself. The reason why I didn't want to do it was I was afraid I couldn't do it. And I thought, well, that's not a good reason. So I ought to try it. So I tried it as a correspondent, and boy, was I bad. I mean, the first time I shot at one of these stand-up pieces you do at the end, I had my head tilted over to one side. I couldn't use it. But I eventually got a little better, and so I worked there for 23 years as a correspondent, and ended up as their chief White House correspondent. And then after 8 years of that, I wanted to move to something else, and they didn't really have anything. And along comes this startup, Fox News, and I talked to them about it, and I thought their concept was right, because I had long thought that the news was too slanted to the left, and that if anybody ever came along with a more balanced product, that it would find its way. And I thought when I went to work there that people were telling me I was crazy, and what was I think I was doing, and leaving the Yankees for an expansion franchise. And I thought, well, I got an idea this is going to work. I think it'll do all right. I thought it might take some years. I had no idea that within a matter of 5 years we'd be number one, and stayed there all that time. I was grateful for that.
Absolutely. Well, your wisdom helped shepherd the success, especially with the Washington, D.C. Bureau. And part of that, I think, is your focus on facts and reporting. Talk about the importance of, you mentioned that the media leans left. Talk about the importance of telling the stories that...
We were basically looking for a couple. First of all, I wanted to observe the old standards that I had learned in my first days as a newspaper man. You report the news without fear or favor. You cover as there are many sides to a story, you cover and report most of them, as many of them as you can reasonably do, and you do it in a way that the people who believe those sides will recognize them, and not some distorted shorthand version of the other side, which you see all too often. And I also thought we were looking for two things. We were looking for stories that no one else was doing, that were legitimate stories, and there were plenty of them around. And the second thing we were looking for is stories that everyone was doing, but doing from a different angle that was equally, if not more, legitimate. So that was what we were striving for in the Washington Bureau, helped inestimably, I must say, by the fact that my wife, Kim, who's a longtime journalist, and we worked together at ABC News, terrific producer, was running the Bureau. And I had the title managing editor. I don't know what that, I kind of never knew what that meant, but I did have some say in how things got done. And then after a year of that, I held that title, but we started this show called Special Report, which is their 6 o'clock news, which is still going today under the very able leadership of Bret Baier. And I I did that for 10 years. I knew I wanted to be an anchor. I didn't think I was a very good anchor. I didn't like to do interviews because I thought I was crummy at it. But we did it, and it ended up in winning its time slot night after night. So it was a good experience.
Absolutely. And you mentioned how journalism gives you a front row seat to some incredible stories and people. Are there one or two favorite journalism experiences that you would like to relate?
Well, sometimes you love a story because it's such a cool story, and sometimes it's just, the story that moved me emotionally more than any other was the 50th anniversary of D-Day. Now, I knew from history what D-Day was about and what a tremendously momentous event it was. But going over there and walking around on those cliffs above those beaches at Normandy and talking to some of the old veterans who had come back, who were well along in years, but they showed up, and it's a hell of a story, and it might have failed, and the courage and the enterprise of those American forces and the Allied forces that landed on those beaches is a powerful story. And I remember when I was which as a journalist covering it, you kind of hope the speeches you're reporting on and playing parts of will help to retell that story, perhaps for an audience that may not know it fully. Well, Bill Clinton, although people don't remember this very well, he gave excellent speeches. And I just wanted to retell the story through the events of the day, of the several days we were there. And I remember when I was trying to lay down my voice track for the piece on D-Day, the anniversary itself, June 6, 1994, my voice kept breaking. And so that was a moment to remember because I was powerfully moved by that. And it was reminded me of what this country is all about, of what its armed forces had done in the world in the 20th century. And I was so grateful to have been a part of that just as a reporter.
Absolutely. And then, about journalism, it gives you access to people. It allows you to ask questions and demand answers. You've covered presidents over the years. Is there any, journalistic experiences covering some of our presidents?
Well, I will tell you this. Yeah, I had strong impressions of a lot of them. I covered the Hill during the Reagan administration, but I had some opportunity to observe him, and I thought he was extremely effective as president and much admired by the people, which is a hard thing to hold on to in this age. And I covered the presidency of George H.W. Bush. They're in here all over the place. I'm sorry about that. They normally won't sting you unless you bother them. I covered his presidency, and I thought he was an admirable figure, and that his management of the post-Cold War world, particularly in Europe, was an underrated achievement. He did a great job of that, and his leadership in the first Gulf War was extraordinary. Very honorable, very decent man. I thought highly of him as a person. And then, of course, I covered Clinton, the most talented politician I've ever met or seen. Nobody's close. Nobody comes close. And I'll never forget one day. I had a lot of misgivings about him, as most people did, because he was a flawed figure, as so many public figures are. Well, I remember being in the Oval Office one time on a photo op, and by this time I'd been at the White House for 6 or 7 years, and I didn't usually go into photo ops. I let somebody else do that. I was lazy, I guess. And I was in on this particular photo op, and all the photo ops in the White House are the same. You're in the Oval Office, the president's in a chair in front of the fireplace, his aides are to his left on a sofa, and the visitor's on his right, and the visitor's aides are on an adjacent opposing sofa. So you come in behind the sofa by the president, cameras get in front, and he looked up at me, Clinton did, and he said, "Hi, Brit." And I thought, what a great guy. He was so charming that he could put in the space of those two words as much likability and charm as most people can pack into an entire speech. And I remember walking back to our workspace there, and I was thinking, that guy is amazing. I was sort of laughing at myself from being so charmed by him with two words. But he was something. He was a force to behold. His charm was a force of nature.
Yeah. But do you agree that the job of journalism gives you access you wouldn't have, allows you to ask questions other people can't,
of course,
demand answers?
No, your front row seat is worth something. If you're interested in the events, obviously, you love being there and witnessing these things and gaining your thoughts and impressions about these people and trying to cover them in an interesting and fair way so that, people of all stripes can watch your work and find it acceptable and informative. And And too often, I think that idea, that effort has been lost in an atmosphere in which people, I'm afraid, get into journalism because they want to influence events. If you can influence events, but it should be a byproduct of your reporting, not the purpose of it. And, you know, I always tried to cover news that way. Now, people know now that I'm a conservative. I went to Fox News and so on. But, you know, by that time, I was at a later stage in my work life where I was allowed to express my opinions. But even in that, I think it's important to try to maintain some balance. You know, you don't denounce people in harsh language because if you do that, you're almost always overstating the case. And that isn't going to help anybody.
Right. So talk about the evolution of journalism from when you started to what it is today, and is it better or worse?
I think it's worse in this respect. There are a lot of very talented young people in journalism, very highly educated. That don't always used to be the case. It used to be a lot of riffraff in journalism. But back in those days, the newspapers were sustained by advertising revenue. And advertising revenue was sustained by the circulation of your publication. And you wanted as many people reading or watching your work as possible because that's what attracted advertising and the advertising dollar. In more recent times, advertising revenue is still important, but subscription revenue or cable fees are the big driver. And so what people are looking for is a loyal audience. And that's true online, it's true in cable now. You want a loyal audience, and in a country as big as this, if you're operating a national news organization, you can be appealing to a niche, but in America, a niche can be very big indeed. And these people tuning in night after night after night will sustain you and allow you and make your channel, if that's what it is, a must carry. And then you get the fees that come from the cable operators, and they're the big driver of profits nowadays. And that's changed things somewhat. So people are maybe trying to appeal to a narrower but still larger audience, and that's what I think has corrupted journalism to some extent.
So how do we, fix journalism? At College Fix, we're training young, bright, talented undergrads to consider a career in journalism. We assign them stories, edit their work, publish it. They get that excitement of seeing their byline. But how do we fix the media or heal it?
Look, I think that some of these journalists that I consider biased, but nonetheless very successful, are having a great time. But there's another way to have a great time, and that is to try to play it straight and be fair and balanced and interesting. Now, that's a challenge. Being interesting and fair is a challenge. And young journalists need to learn how to do that. They also need what I think is a balanced understanding of American history, which, if you're covering national politics, is valuable to go in with, and they won't be so susceptible to the propaganda about America being evil or our allies being evil or American foreign policy is what's wrong with the world and all that. A balanced perspective would be very helpful, and education can have a big say in that.
But and I don't mean to sound dramatic, but the country is very divided right now, and you're either getting your information from A or B, right? And so do you feel that conservative, independent journalism is one of the last, strongholds that we can tell the truth and inform people? I mean, we're the fourth estate, we're holding people accountable. It's an important job, patriotic almost in a way.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be conservative. What it has to be is independent and balanced. Now, look, the quickest way to spice up a story is to insert an opinion into it. And it gets people's attention. It may, particularly if it agrees with their priors, and people like that. So you have to find a way to be interesting while being fair. That's a challenge. But it's a great contribution. I think, Fox News is widely known for its opinion shows, which have been very successful. They air mostly in the evenings, early morning to some extent. A lot of opinionated stuff, and audiences like that. But we do a lot of straight news reporting too, which I think people trust. And I'm stunned, for example, at the stuff that comes out of the AP report these days. Just amazing to me. I mean, you see Hassan Nasrallah gets killed, and they obits for him, and coming from the AP and elsewhere, paint him as somebody's, like your avuncular relative who's, charming and inspirational, and the guy's a murderer. The guy's a monster. and is responsible for the deaths of thousands of people by virtue of terrorism. And that kind of coverage is just amazing to me that it gets by. And I can't believe that people trust it. And I think that sort of stuff is an example of what accounts for the loss of faith in much media today.
Right. So where do we create more avenues for this balanced, fact-filled, independent journalism? How do we turn this Titanic?
Education and training, right? Education and training. Properly educated students can become fair-minded journalists. And if that's what's prized, I mean, it's a value that to some extent has been lost in the search for clicks and circulation of a particular kind. I mean, I think of the New York Times and what's happened to it. It used to be the absolute beacon of straightforward reporting, and the journalists who worked there were not allowed to inject their personal opinions, and didn't to a great extent. Abe Rosenthal, the legendary editor at the time, said that, he said to me, I interviewed there one time for a job I didn't ultimately take, and he said that when he was gone, he wanted people to say of him, he kept the paper straight. It's on his gravestone. It's the right mission. And to a great extent, it's been lost. And with it, faith in the media. There's a chance, that this isn't working in a lot of places. Newspapers are going under. There are a lot of reasons for that. But the loss of broadly held faith in journalists' work is responsible for that as well. And I think, somebody might wake up and say, well, maybe we ought to do it differently. And I thought, frankly, that one of the perils of our success was that, people would copy us and we'd lose our competitive advantage. Nobody has. I mean, there are a couple of lesser channels that are well more opinionated than we are, and they've found a place. But nobody on the media, the traditional media, has really done much of a job of countering what we do by doing what we do.
So the death of journalism has been greatly exaggerated, and you see opportunity for independent, fair-minded journalism.
I do. I think there is an opportunity for that. I think it's a concept that can work. Now, it takes skill, right? And it takes, proper education. I'm not sure what these students that come out of college these days are being taught. I mean, you see terrible examples of it in these protests at places like Columbia University against Israel in this war with terrorists. And you think, what are these people being taught that they think this stuff? So.
Yeah. Well, we do train the students. I always tell them, give me the who, what, where, when, and why. Don't use hyperbole. Don't use exaggeration. And I don't care about your opinion. But
that's the right message.
Thank you. And we really try to hammer it home. I started in a daily newspaper myself, so I'm trying to keep that spirit alive. But what is the role of opinion journalism today?
It's a vital and very valuable part of journalism, and it always has been. What you need is a clear line, a bifurcation between news and opinion, where you don't leak where the opinions don't leak into the news coverage. And then, people on the opinion side, unless they're saying crazy stuff, like, we didn't go to the moon or whatever, you keep that stuff out because it's nuts. But wide range of opinion on your editorial pages is a valuable thing. It gives everybody who's reading the paper somebody they can root for, right? Or root against, as the case may be. That's all fine.
Right. Do you think that journalism, in a way, is patriotic?
Of course. I mean, it's a service to the public to cover the news accurately and fairly, and people appreciate it, and they need it to make decisions about for whom to vote and so on. So it's patriotic.
Okay. So all hope is not lost. What's the case for a young person to go into journalism or a career in the media today?
Front row seat at interesting events. You don't have to sit there and worry about being affected by them. You're on the sidelines. You stay on the sidelines, but you get the best seat at all these things, and you get to go tell people about it. That's fun. That's interesting.
Yeah. Is there anything about journalism that you want to share that I haven't asked? Something on your mind about just a career in the media or a message to young people?
It used to be that you consign yourself to a life of near poverty by working in journalism, but you can make a pretty decent living in it now too. So that's attractive.
Absolutely. And it seems like it's evolving and there's new opportunity and growth.
Yeah. And one of the problems, of course, is that if you're if you're someone who's smart and has a bright future ahead of you, you have to make a choice. Do you want to go to Washington and cover the agriculture department or cover the state capitol in wherever you are and make a modest living? Or do you want to go out into the private sector and work in a private enterprise company and do better sooner financially? You can, over time, make a decent living in journalism, or maybe even a really great living. Some of these TV stars make huge amounts of money, but you can't count on that. So if you're looking for a reason to go into journalism, and it won't be the money, you got to like the work. And I think that's why a lot of people who are conservatives, pro-business, basically, right, pro-private enterprise, want to go and be part of that more than they want to be covering some government body in Washington or somewhere.
But you can confirm after decades in journalism that it's fun and exciting and never a dull moment?
Well, I'm 81 years old and I'm still trying to do it, so you can tell I liked it.
That's wonderful. Where do you get your news, Brit?
Well, I read several newspapers every day, online. I sit in this chair over here with an iPad on my lap, and I start early in the morning and I read Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Not every word in every one of them, and I'm active on X, formerly Twitter, and you build up over time on Twitter a list of other accounts that you follow, and they are bursting with links to articles you might not run into in either of those three publications, and I pick up a tremendous amount of information from them, both news and opinion. And I read that, and I keep in touch with that throughout the day. Actually, just checking my phone or whatever, and so you end up reading all kinds of stuff. I mean, that you wouldn't find out about from just those three publications.
In fact, you've retweeted the College Fix on occasion, which is very exciting.
I have indeed.
So at Fox News, you ran a segment called Campus Craziness. Some of the College Fix stories often were featured in that. Tell us about campus craziness coverage and why it's important.
Well, we did a segment when I went back to anchoring, 8 years ago for a couple of months, and I had to kind of recreate a show that I was anchoring, and I was looking for things that I could put in that people would find interesting. And there's all this nutty stuff going on the campuses, and it didn't always get coverage. So I used to turn to all sorts of different sites, including the College Fix, which was keeping an eye on that sort of stuff. For example, so we'd do 2 or 3. I'd just tell them. We didn't have anything fancy to go with them. We didn't have any correspondence on the scene. We just reported what we had found out. And I used the College Fix with considerable regularity during that period for that particular feature.
Well, thank you. We appreciate that. And so prior to the election, a story about a town in Ohio in which immigrants were eating cats and dogs went viral, prompted some citizen journalism, and really kind of weighed in on what might be right or wrong with journalism today. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the trouble with that story from the beginning was it was such a shocking story that before you touch a story like that, you want some serious confirmation that that's actually happening. And if you got people saying it, well, who are they, and what is their evidence? Did they witness this, and that sort of thing? So that's the kind of story that you would approach with interest but extreme caution, and that was what was merited in that story. And of course, I think by and large, the story got pretty well debunked as it deserved to be, and the political campaign that had tried to make hay of it, I think, didn't get anywhere with it.
Yeah. So always be cautious and get the facts.
Particularly when people are said to be eating their pets.
And some ducks and other things too.
Yeah, they make geese, yeah.
Yeah, there it is.
One last thing that I'm just curious about, and I don't know if you've ever talked about this, Brit, if you don't want to, it's fine, but in 1972, you were working for Jack Anderson, the CIA tapped your phone. And are there threats from the government, even with the First Amendment, to journalists and their ability to do their jobs?
Well, power corrupts. And, I was working for Jack Anderson. We were spied on by the CIA, and we all had code names. Mine was Eggnog. And they had a listening post set up in an office building across the street, right down K Street in Washington. And we didn't find out about it really until later, but it was a big deal when we found out about it, because it came out in papers that came out during the decline of the Nixon administration. And for some reason, I wasn't. I mean, obviously, you don't approve of that kind of thing. The CIA is supposed to have no domestic surveillance or intelligence role under its charter and under the law. So it was sort of hopelessly illegal, and I was sort of fascinated by it. They weren't going to find anything, but they had no business doing it. And it's alarming when government agencies and officials in power overstep their authority and do things like that. I mean, it's not what we're supposed to be as Americans. We're not supposed to have to worry about that.
But what's interesting about that is it's sort of an illustration of how the pen is mightier than the sword, and journalists do wield power, do they not?
Well, Jack Anderson had done a story about the Nixon administration's tilt during a war between India and Pakistan toward Pakistan. India was a nominal ally and the largest democracy on earth at the time, and so the tilt toward the dictatorship in Pakistan was notable, and it had strategic reasons for it. I'm not going to argue that. But it was a hell of a story, and it was based on papers that had leaked. So obviously the CIA was worried about the leaks and was trying to do what it could to find the source of them and so on. I don't think they ever did, or maybe they did, but I don't think it ended. But I mean, someone like me, I was just a lowly member of the staff there doing reporting, and but it did show that governments are extremely sensitive to news coverage, particularly when you have something comes along that completely blows up what they're saying publicly and proves it to be false.
Right. But I have told the young people I work with that with great power comes great responsibility in terms of journalism, and I think that's something that you can relate to in terms of telling these kids, get the facts straight, don't insert your opinion, but the pen is mightier than the sword. And
if somebody steals papers and give them to you, that's one thing. If you go to steal them yourself, that's another.
Don't do that.
Don't do that.
Over the course of your career, are there one or two journalists that really stand out as a model, somebody you look up to?
Well, I used to say, and to some extent still do, that I wanted to know every day of my work as a journalist what Fred Barnes was thinking. We have been friends since we were in high school, and I considered him in many ways my best friend. He had a lot of influence on me. And yeah, Fred was a conservative, but he was a straight shooter as a journalist and a very fine journalist. And of course, in the world of opinion, we all looked up to Charles Krauthammer, not just because he was so brilliant, but also because he was one of the nicest men I've ever known in my life. Those are just a couple of examples. There were numerous others.
Absolutely. Brit Hume, thank you very much for your contributions to journalism and everything that you're leaving behind. A great legacy of fair and balanced and unafraid.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Hello again, John Miller here. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, leave a comment, subscribe. Also, visit our website at The College Fix. If you're a student and you'd like to join The College Fix and try out journalism, find the button on our homepage and an editor will contact you. We got more videos coming. Please stay tuned.